before winning the fight in the 9th. The Golden Age. Perhaps the greatest decade for heavyweights in boxing history. Perhaps. The 1960s has seen majority domination by the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, the ring's fighter of the decade, Muhammad Ali. But he'd been forced into exile after he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. Ali's undisputed title was split up, and in his absence, the WBA issued an 8-man tournament to decide who would be world champion. Joe Frazier boycotted the tournament on the grounds that his superior ranking rendered any bout against lower-ranked competitors unnecessary. Jimmy Ellis, who was an old companion of Ali's, would end up winning this tournament and the title, while Joe Frazier would take down Buster Mathis Sr. for the New York State Athletic Commission's championship. Now I should clarify. The title was state jurisdiction-based, with Ellis recognized in 44 states and Frazier in only 6. Even so, Frazier's recognition carried more prestige, as New York was prime time for heavyweight boxing. In 1967, radio producer Murray Warner had the brilliant idea to do a fantasy matchup to find the best heavyweight champion of all time. A bracket was conceived of which Muhammad Ali, Rocky Marciano, Joe Louis, and Jersey Joe Walcott were included. Ultimately, Marciano won the entire tournament and was gifted a legitimate gold and diamond championship belt worth $10,000. Ali was furious that he was eliminated in the second round at the hands of Jim Jeffries, whom he deemed to be history's clumsiest and slow-footed fighter. He filed a lawsuit of defamation of character. The suit was settled when Warner offered to pay Ali $10,000 and to stage a super fight between he and Marciano, of which the winner would be decided by a computer. In February of 1969, Ali and Marciano boxed 70 to 75 rounds in a studio in Miami for the bout. Rocky lost 50 pounds and wore a toupee to appear as close as he could to his prime. On January 20th, 1970, 1,500 theaters across the United States, Canada, and Europe witnessed the results of the NCR 315 computer. The results differed depending on where it was aired. America and Canada saw Marciano knock Ali out in the 13th round, while Europe saw Ali knock Marciano out, also in the 13th round. Ali filed another lawsuit for defamation of character over the grounds that the film was promoted as a legitimate fight and not staged. He withdrew the lawsuit after seeing the European version. Unfortunately, 3 weeks after filming finished, Rocky Marciano died in a plane crash on the eve of his 46th birthday. He never got to see the results of the fantasy bout, but he and Ali left the studio on good terms. For years, the event was in limbo, seeing random airings on TV and allegedly being destroyed. That was until December 27, 2005, in which the super fight was released on DVD along with a documentary on the film, archival footage, audio of the original radio fantasy fights, and more features. It has also been televised. It's also worth noting that the super fight inspired Rocky Balboa, the 6th film in the Rocky franchise, being featured as a plot device to get Rocky out of retirement. On the undercard of the heavyweight unification bout, the young lion, rising contender in 1968 Olympic champion with only 15 fights, Big George Foreman, took on experienced journeyman Gregorio Peralta. The fight went the distance, showing that the imposing Foreman wasn't as invincible as his knockout percentage asserted. The decision, however, drew ire from the crowd, who felt that Peralta, at the very least, deserved a better nod score-wise from the judges, who'd all scored the fight overwhelmingly in favor of George Foreman. George secured the unanimous decision, but not without suffering a cut over his right eye. Peralta was cheered as he exited the ring. Muhammad Ali also reportedly studied this fight for his own match with Foreman 4 years later. It had been almost 3 years since the heavyweight title was in one piece, the night Muhammad Ali stopped Zora Folley in 7 rounds. The title was divided soon after, with Ali's suspension, and it would take some time to agree to unification. On December 29, 1969, Joe Frazier and Jimmy Ellis finally reached a deal to fight for unification after petty disputes led the two to exhaust their remaining competition. 2 weeks before the bout, Muhammad Ali surrendered the lineage by announcing his retirement for the sake of a new champion being formally acknowledged. It allowed heavyweight boxing to finally move on without him. Timing sure is a poochie. It was clear to all observers that the two men were on a collision course, one that would see fulfillment on February 16th at Madison Square Garden in New York City, New York. This bout would see Joe Frazier become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, unifying the WBA and the now WBC titles when Angelo Dundee stopped the fight between rounds after Joe had battered and knocked down Ellis twice in the 5th round. There was now only one obstacle in the way of smoking Joe Frazier from holding heavyweight supremacy: the lineal champion. To some, the true champion. The man who'd never lost his crown to begin with, and who was soon to return from his forced exile. The greatest, Muhammad Ali. Frazier had beaten one Dundee-trained fighter. Now, could he beat his best? The answer would come 1 year later, in what may be the greatest fight of all time. The Bellflower Bomber, Jerry Quarry, a notable contender from the 60s who fought for the different versions of the title, continued his bounce back since losing by knockout to similar standing contender George Chuvalo. His victim by 6th-round knockout was undefeated Mac Foster. Quarry had fought most of the best the 60s had to offer and was on his way to fighting the man who was the absolute best of the 60s in 4 months' time. On June 29th at the Armory in Jersey City, New Jersey, Charles "Sonny" Liston would square off against the real-life Rocky, the band bleeder Chuck Wepner. The bout would see Wepner get some decent shots in, but ultimately face a difficult night as Liston opened him up and made his face a crimson mask. Liston knocked Wepner down in the 5th round before winning the fight in the 9th when it was stopped on cuts by a ringside doctor. It isn't talked about much, but Sonny Liston was forging his own path back to the heavyweight championship. Outside of a fluke knockout loss in 1969, Liston was undefeated since his 2 losses to Muhammad Ali. Imagine if Liston had gotten his shot for the title against Smokin' Joe, with Ali on the horizon. Unfortunately, this would never come to be, as tragedy would rob us of this pipe dream. On August 4th, also at Madison Square Garden, The young 1968 Olympic gold medalist and soon-to-be master knockout artist, Big George Foreman, would square off against arguably the greatest chin in boxing history, Boom Boom George Chuvalo. The Battle of the Georges was competitive enough in the first 2 rounds, with Foreman lashing out with wild punches and Chuvalo digging into the body. Chuvalo's left eye was already beginning to swell, and in the 3rd round toward the end, Foreman would begin a series of battering ram barrages on Chuvalo. Chuvalo even staggered at one point, but never did he appear to be on his way down, or at least he himself thought as much. Foreman never let up, beating Chuvalo, who wasn't throwing much back, in his own corner, and the fight would be stopped by referee Arthur Mercanti by way of 3rd round technical knockout. Chuvalo insists to this day that the fight was stopped too soon and thinks he would have gassed Foreman and knocked him out as the fight went on. Given what would happen 4 years later in Zaire, he just may have had a point. The gentleman of boxing, Floyd Patterson, returned from a 2-year layoff. It was almost 2 years to the day, just 1 day too late, since Floyd had dropped a WBA title bout decision to Jimmy Ellis. A year before that, Patterson was eliminated from the WBA Eliminator Tournament after 2 close wars with Jerry Quarry. In the present, Floyd secured a 10th round knockout over Charlie Devil Green. The bout is notable for the impromptu brawl that broke out after the bell rung to end round 4. Also, Patterson went to help Green up after the knockdown, thinking his opponent had slipped. It had been 3.5 years since Muhammad Ali last competed in his typical dominant style win, then over Zora Foley. Following the bout, he was stripped of his title for his refusal to be drafted into the Vietnam War, and regaining his license to box would prove to be his greatest challenge thus far. Far greater than any challenger had been up to that point. It almost happened in California, but then Governor Ronald Reagan blocked this, stating that a draft dodger would get no such chance in the Golden State. It's ironic considering Ali would endorse Reagan years later, and the two got on pretty well. Atlanta would end up being the hot spot, as then Governor Lester Maddox had no such power to overrule the city's decision. Ali regained his license on August 12th of 1970, and would be back in the ring just 1 month later on October 26th at Atlanta City Auditorium against high-ranked contender, Irish Jerry Quarry. Ali's return would mark the City Auditorium as a haven for Black Power on this night. As for the fight, whether or not Ali was right to justify himself as the true champion was still on the line. For the most part, Ali was looking pretty good, even dancing Quarry around the ring, but he was getting caught by a game Quarry from time to time. It may not have been clear to those who were in awe of his return that night, but looking back, it's clear as day Ali's supernatural talents had eroded a fair bit in his 3.5 years away from the sweet science. If it wasn't clear in this fight or in his next against Oscar Bonavena, it would certainly become clear in the fight of the century. Ali won the fight by technical knockout after a cut he'd opened up over Quarry's eye in the 3rd round proved too much for the insight of referee Tony Perez between rounds. Ali had proven himself by returning against a high-ranked and experienced contender with this win over the Bellflower Bomber, and was one step closer to a traditional unification bout against smoking Joe Frazier. On November 18th, did rising young lion Big George Foreman decimate Boone Kirkman in the 2nd round after 2 knockdowns. Most notable was Foreman storming out of his corner at the opening bell and straight up shoving Kirkman to the ground. It gets a good laugh out of me every time without fail. Also on November 18th, at Cobo Arena in Detroit, Michigan, Smokin' Joe Frazier would make the first defense of his near undisputed title against the reigning light heavyweight champion, the deputy sheriff, Bob Foster. Foster had grown curious of what was above him and ventured into the realm of the big dogs, It wasn't pretty. For Foster, that is. Whereas we know the great success stories like Evander Holyfield, Michael Spinks, and Ezra Charles, all former lower weight class champs who took the leap to heavyweight success, Bob Foster was unfortunate in his leap. Foster took the boxer's approach to Smokin' Joe, but to no avail, as the pressure was just too much. Frazier got Foster out of there quick, stopping him in 2 rounds. The first knockdown was a bomb of a left hook that sent Foster back and down. He would answer the count, but eat an even worse dynamite left hook that would end his night. That shot from Frazier sent Foster to the canvas via the ropes first, as he brushed him on his way down. Light work for the world champion, and he too was now one step closer to answering the question everyone had. Who's the true, undefeated, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world? In the last important bout of 1970, Muhammad Ali squared off against the man known as Ringo, Oscar Bonavena. The bout took place on December 7th at Madison Square Garden and would serve as a more telling image of how Ali's skills had eroded during his layoff. Ali was up against a tough customer in Ringo, and the fact that he'd chosen to face him so soon into his comeback speaks volumes on the greatest competitive spirit. Bonavena had gone to war twice with Smokin' Joe back in the 60s, the man Ali was gunning for to regain the title he'd never lost. In their first fight, Oscar dropped Joe twice in the second round before Frazier rallied back to capture a split decision win. Their second fight was a grueling 15-round unanimous decision win for Frazier that saw Bonavena gain the respect of the boxing world. It's clear what narrative Ali was building by choosing to face Bonavena. Oscar spent the pre-fight taunting Ali by calling him a coward who dodged the draft, and consistently jabbing at him by calling him Clay. Of course, Ali was ready to punish Bonavena, as he'd done to Floyd Patterson and Ernie Terrell before. The fight was one-sided, but not in previous Ali fashion. Ali was outlanding Bonavena while taking some blows himself. This was a new Ali, who was willing to stand flat and exchange blows, also showing that he had an elite chin in his own right. The decisive round would be the very last one, in which Ali stopped Oscar by 3 knockdowns. Ringo had never been stopped before, and he'd never be stopped again. Anyone who was expecting to see the hit without getting hit Ali experienced their first rude awakening. The second would come in March of the next year. December 30th of 1970 was an interesting day for the world of boxing. On one hand, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier reached a deal to fight in March to crown the true undisputed champ. Both men were undefeated and held a legitimate claim to the lineage, the Ring Magazine's title, and the Alphabet titles. Ali had 2 tune-up bouts, and Frazier was rolling as champ. There had been an interesting war of words across the media between the two dating back to the late 60s. Behind the scenes, however, Joe Frazier had been there as a brother for Ali in dark times for the exiled champ. Perhaps Joe felt betrayed at how vicious Ali was towards him in the press. Smokin' Joe dared to lash out at Ali in the way that always worked to get him worked up. He called him Cassius Clay. Ali notoriously tortured the 3 men who had done this before, Patterson, Terrell, and Bonavena. Would Joe Frazier suffer the same fate? The time was right to settle who the best man really was. Now, on the other hand, this day will live in infamy for the mysterious case of Charles Sonny Liston's death. He was found dead by his widow, and the question still remained today on how he died. Was it a drug overdose, heart failure, a hit by the mob? Imagine the dream matches we could have had with Sonny surviving and going forward on his trek toward the title throughout the 70s. He was gunning for Frazier already. There may have been a third Ali fight. He may have collided with his former sparring partner George Foreman, and so much more that we'll never get to see. Liston and all those he knew took most of what they knew of the former champ to their graves. The world will never truly know what happened, but we do know that he was a great champion and that he will live forever in the hearts of boxing fans worldwide. At the end of 1970, these were Ring Magazine's top 10 ranked heavyweights. 1970 flipped the script from the up and down 1960s. Joe Frazier was the alphabet man, and Muhammad Ali was finally back. They were the last remaining question as the division finally looked to be back on its way to unification. Jerry Quarry snatching Mac Foster's O is taking upset of the year. Quarry had built himself into a contender you could miss, making the work of Muhammad Ali all the more impressive on the year. The Ring's round of the year was round 15 of the Ali-Bonavena matchup. Ali was the only man to stop Bonavena and did so in dramatic fashion via 3 knockdown rule. He was looking better and better on his road back to the title. No heavyweight bout won fight of the year, but if one had to be chosen, it'd have to be the bout between Joe Frazier and Jimmy Ellis, where Frazier unified the alphabet titles in dominant fashion en route to the fight of the century. Ali-Bonavena comes close with his dramatic finish, but Frazier was a man on a mission and was running the show in 1970. Logically, the Ring's fighter of the year was the champion, Smokin' Joe Frazier. Joe had a great 1970, and the next year would be even greater for the champ. On January 10th, Oscar Bonavena, continuing his active schedule from the 60s, opened the decade in a disqualification loss. On January 26, George Foreman scored a 5th-round knockout over future Superman movie star Jack O'Halloran. The win earned him the match against Gregorio Peralta on the Frazier-Ellis undercard. On March 24th, Henry Cooper won a unanimous decision over Jack Bodell. On April 17th, George Foreman stopped James J. Woody in 3 rounds, referee Johnny Colin stepping in having seen enough of Foreman's one-sided destruction. Ken Norton was featured in Ring Magazine as one of the 5 young lions to look out for. He'd won 7 of his 8 fights that year and had also sparred with both Ali and Frazier. Another among the 5 young lions, Olympic champion George Foreman, was on a tear, having knocked out 11 of his 12 victims in the year. His record was up to 25-0 with 22 knockouts, and he was gaining momentum as a definitive rising star amongst heavyweights, punctuated by his TKO win over contender George Chuvalo. Joe Bugner was another of the 5 lions and had spent the summer of 1970 sparring with Ali, Frazier, Ellis, and Liston. He also scored a win over Chuck Wepner in September. Overall, 1970 was looking to be a resurgence year for the heavyweight division, as not only was Muhammad Ali back, but the division as a whole was back, following the slump that occurred at Ali's exile in 1967.
YouTube Premium is ad-free YouTube and background play, so you can watch videos while
The career of the mysterious Big Bear, Sonny Liston, was puzzling. The organized crime that got him off the ground to fight would come back to derail him later. His journey to the world title saw him lose only once in a fight that he probably would have won had he not been horsing around. Liston also beat Cleveland Big Cat Williams twice in what may be 2 of his finest performances. That is until you get to Liston's bouts with the champion Floyd Patterson. Liston dominated Patterson twice and looked invincible. After years of being ducked with the title that eluded him, Sonny Liston was finally the heavyweight champion of the world. And this all came crashing down when he met the young rising contender Cassius Clay. Liston lost both bouts to the man who would become Muhammad Ali and continued on the comeback trail until his untimely death in 1970 after having last thrashed Chuck Wepner. Liston also talked up a bout with the champion Joe Frazier, stating how it'd be like shooting fish in a barrel. Judging by the destruction of Frazier at the hands of Liston's sparring partner George Foreman years later, Liston may have been correct in his assessment of a potential bout with Smokin' Joe. On January 9th of 1971, people of all walks of life gathered to remember the life of the fallen champion, Charles Sonny Liston. Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Joe Louis were among the legendary champions in attendance. Sonny's widow, Geraldine, infamously exclaimed while lingering over her husband's coffin, "What happened to you, Sonny?" Liston's career ended with a record of 50 wins, 4 losses, and 0 draws. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1991. And we can only wonder, how would Sonny Liston have affected the heavyweight scene of the 70s on his comeback trail? Imagine a third match against the eroded Ali and matches against Frazier, Foreman, Norton, Shavers, Holmes, and more. Alas, it wasn't meant to be. Rest in peace to the man who may be the most devastating and feared force in boxing history. Muhammad Ali finally got the fight he'd hungered for, a bout against Smokin' Joe Frazier. But perhaps it was Frazier who'd hungered for this bout even more. Both men had a legitimate claim to the lineage and the title, being undefeated and undisputed in their own right. They were also Olympic gold medalists, Ali from 1960 and Frazier from 1964. This fight took center stage, seeing celebrities and public figures from around all walks of life gather to witness the fight of the century. Ali had spent the build-up to the fight verbally hammering away at Joe, and Frazier didn't find his antics as funny as some others would. The night of the fight, we'd see how Joe really felt, when the undisputed title was up for grabs. For 15 long, painful rounds, the two men would beat and batter one another, much to the delight of the crowd and all onlookers around the world and across time. Ali took a new initiative in this fight, choosing to stand flat-footed in exchange with Smokin' Joe, and he was teeing off on the champ. But strangely enough, this would ultimately prove his downfall, as Frazier's relentless pressure, shots to the body, and cleaner blows that shook Ali would win him a unanimous decision. The decision was only sealed off by the knockdown in the 15th round. Joe Frazier had shocked and shook up the world in his own right. He had unified the titles that were splintered after Ali's exile, and he'd now beaten Ali to claim his right to the lineage and the Ring Magazine's championship. Joe Frazier was the heavyweight champion of the world in every facet, unopposed, undisputed, and unchecked. This fight definitely took some years off of the careers and lives of both men. Frazier would never reach this height of prominence again, using a lot of his career's proverbial tank here to beat the Louisville Lip. Frazier remained in the hospital for weeks and understandably took the rest of the year off. Honestly, he could have retired after a win like that. Ali got the better of the night's exchange career-wise, as it served as half of the wake-up call all greats need. He would fight 3 more times in the year and win them all while continuing to grow a celebrity around the world. All this despite him losing the fight of the century. Across the seas, Henry Cooper had his last bout when he faced off against Joe Bugner. The site, known in the modern day as Wembley Arena, was the perfect site for the British legend to hang up the gloves, and even in defeat, he had the heart of his people. Bugner's flurry in the 15th round may have secured him the decision. Aussie Joe won the fight, but himself felt he never quite recovered from the backlash he received after narrowing out the win against our Henry. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any footage of the event, but its significance begs to be addressed. On May 10th at the Coliseum Arena in Oakland, California, Olympic champion George Foreman and Argentinian rival Gregorio Peralta engaged in a rematch of their controversial 1970 bout. The bout was for the NABF title that was vacated by Muhammad Ali so that he could face Joe Frazier. This time around, Foreman was out to right the wrong of the first bout. He opened a cut over Peralta's left eye in round 3 and staggered him in the 7th with 2 left hooks. In the 10th, the referee had seen enough, as Foreman was battering Peralta, who was leaning on the ropes after already taking a standing 8 count. George Foreman shut down his critics with a big win here. Just 4 months after the fight of the century, while his rival took the rest of the year off to properly recover, Muhammad Ali returned to the ring to embark on his comeback against his friend and gym mate, Jimmy Ellis. The bout was for the vacant NABF heavyweight title, as George Foreman had relinquished it. Ellis was coming off of a unanimous decision win over George Chuvalo. That night in the Houston Astrodome, the Muhammad Ali that the world had come to know in the 1960s appeared to re-emerge. He was bouncy, stinging with his sharp shots and slipping blows. In the 12th round, Ali started banging away at Ellis with precise uppercuts, hooks, and straights. The referee would call a halt to the action, giving Ali the stoppage victory over his friend. It's also worth noting that Angelo Dundee, Ali's usual trainer, wasn't in his corner that night. Dundee made an agreement with Ali to train Ellis, whom he also normally trained and managed, as a means of getting a higher payday for the fight. Ali would go on to continue his march back to the title, and fans yearned for the rematch with Frazier, but would have to wait another 2 years, where the circumstances would be very different. In the venue that would come to be known as Wembley Arena, Joe Bugner suffered a setback when he was outpointed by Jack Buttell, completely